And then let me share my screen. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So, of course, this event is called Wilton Now What? And I'm going to start by introducing myself. My name is Diane Solorio. I am the Director of Advocacy for El Concilio. And yeah, in this event, like I mentioned, the stuff and everything will be monitored closely. So please be mindful. Again, if you missed that first part. But yeah, please make sure to keep your mics muted if needed, and unless you need to speak. And we will end with the Q&A session. So, oh yeah, and my pronouns are she, her. So go ahead and move on and continue with introductions from our panelists. Dr. Bynum, if you'd like to go first. If you could please like introduce yourselves, your name, pronouns, and just like what do you study, like what do you research? Yeah, what your focus is.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here today. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, perfect. So I'm Dr. Catherine Bynum. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies here at ASU. This is my first semester teaching here, so I'm really excited to be part of this panel. But my research focuses on Black and Brown organizing against police brutality in Texas throughout the 20th century. And I'm currently teaching a class called Race, Crime, and the Law, which focuses on the historicizing the ongoing rebellions against police violence in the summer of 2020. So.
Thank you. Dr. Viña, if you could go next, please.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Dr. Bynum. Hi, Dr. Bailey. I'm Alexander Viña. I'm an associate professor of history, also in Shippers with Dr. Bynum, my colleague in Shippers. I am a historian of modern Latin America, focusing on Mexico. I focus on the history of the left in Mexico, on guerrilla movements, social movements, and currently working on a book project looking at the links between state violence, political violence, and narco trafficking in Mexico in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Okay, thank you. And then finally, Mr. Bailey.
Hi, I'm Dr. Marlon M. Bailey. Hello, Dr. Viña, Dr. Bynum. It's a pleasure to meet both of you. I'm an associate professor of Women and Gender Studies, African American Studies, and American Studies in the School of Social Transformation. I'm also the faculty coordinator of the LGBT undergraduate certificate for the university. I'm an ethnographer of sexuality and gender. I work on Black LGBT cultural formations. I specialize in my classes in queer theory, Black queer theory, queer color critique, sexuality studies broadly, particularly focusing on Black communities. And I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. We're excited to have each and every one of you here. Yeah, I know when I was hosting this panel, I knew that I wanted to learn from professors that like focus on activism, and so yeah, we're excited to have you here. So we're gonna go ahead and get started with the first question. Like obviously this event is just to look at, just process the election. It was a big election, there's a lot going on, and just like, you know, give us a space to just kind of like try to understand and cope with what's going on. So for the first question, I guess I just kind of wanted to ask you guys, because you all have like your research and areas of expertise. So how would you define oppression, and how would you define liberation? Like what does oppression and liberation look like based on your research? So I don't know who wants to take that question first, but feel free to just jump in. It's just a casual conversation. So
I can go first. I forgot to mention that really important to mention that my research is on HIV prevention. So I'm a HIV prevention researcher and activist. this speaks to the question. From my vantage point, I think about oppression as the state and systemic form of conditions that prevent individual and collective self-determination and liberty. I want to put a caveat on liberty, though, because the state is also responsible for protecting those who are disadvantaged from being exploited, from being um, discriminated against, and from other people violating their liberty. And so we find ourselves in a situation, and the reason why this is an important point, because a lot of the right-wing and conservative um, aspects of our population and our government have been throwing around this whole notion of liberty, and only speaking in terms of liberty for themselves, but wanting to have the liberty to oppress, to discriminate against other people. And that's not liberty, right? So yeah, I would say my definition of liberty, particularly in my research with regards to sex, gender, sexuality, and racial communities, racialized communities, is the ability to have self-determination, to have autonomy over one's body, um, autonomy over one's life, and as a community to have the ability to raise the quality or realize high quality of life and being protected and having those rights and the ability for quality of life being protected by the state and its communities.
Such an important question, you know, like it's one of the themes pretty much of my entire class, like how are we defining these terms of oppression versus liberation? And I like to think of it of like acts of discrimination, and then also how are we resisting those acts of discrimination? Those are huge themes throughout my entire course. So when I look at oppression in my own research, I think of it as institutional types of power in which a select group holds control over other groups of people. And the way that I like to center a lot of my own research and a lot of focus on my own class are by defining these struggles as ones of liberation, meaning not only freedom from certain abuses from the oppressing class, but also the freedom to do other things, to live freely amongst other people and to be able to have the same access and opportunities as others. So it's an extremely important question, and especially in a political climate like this, as Dr. Bailey was pointing out, because a lot of you know, right-wing activists will throw around these terms that their liberties are being oppressed in some ways, but they're not necessarily recognizing that they're the ones who are also doing a lot of oppressing of other marginalized, of traditionally marginalized and underrepresented groups as well.
I don't have much to add. Those are excellent. I mean, I really love Dr. Bailey's emphasis on self-determination, right? And I think when we talk about oppression and liberation, it's a relationship, right? Oppression tends to produce and create liberatory attempts. But I think that Dr. Bailey's broader conception of oppression as the inability of individuals and communities and groups of people as unable to practice and exert various levels of self-determination, I think is a really important way to think about this, particularly how if we move from oppression to liberation, because if oppression works on multiple axes, right? And if we miss that out, that then has really potentially severe consequences on limiting the opportunities and the possibilities of liberation, right? So when we think about oppression, it operates on the axes of gender, of sexuality, of class, of race. In a place like Arizona, it fundamentally begins with the physical landscape, right? We're on stolen land, right? So I think we have to think of these, the multi-dimensionality of oppression in order to try to work toward a liberation that is liberatory for everyone, right? That no demands, dreams, values, utopias are secondary to, or are placed in a secondary position to the very process of political liberation, right? So for me, a thinker who has influenced me since my freshman year of college, when I picked up his book and it blew my mind, was Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, right? And something that I learned from Fanon is that national liberation, or the struggle against colonialism, is actually only the first step, and it's a step that can allot a series of possibilities, right? But it's only a step, and we can mess that up if we don't think about oppression in terms of these multiple axes. Obviously, he was not looking at some of these, right, in terms of gender and sexuality, but he left us, I think, a really important lesson as to, again, thinking about the multidimensional aspect of oppression as leading to a multidimensional definition of liberation.
Thank you, thank you. I loved everyone's response. I'm sorry, I'm having such a hard time with Zoom, but just give me 1 second. Okay. I lost my mouse.
If you want, then I can share my screen.
Okay, yeah, actually, can you do that, because my computer is like not responding. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, so particularly in Arizona, based off of your all of your definitions on oppression and liberation, I think that's a good place to start and continue on with this conversation. But particularly in Arizona, communities of color showed up in the 2020 election at unprecedented levels. It was all over the news, made national news, and a lot of people credit this to Biden and Kelly's win in Arizona. So, like, what does a Democratic presidency mean for marginalized groups in the United States, considering that, you know, they are the ones that are being credited at the moment for this historic win? And what does it mean for, like, oppressed groups or communities abroad, like outside of the U.S.?
I'll take a stab at it. I think this is all of these are really good questions. So, you put together an excellent panel, my colleagues and I. I think one of the things that I'd like to begin to have us think about in terms of this election, and I'm not an electoral politics expert, I'm a cultural politics expert. Cultural politics inform and underpin electoral politics. And one of the things that I think that we miss when we talk about this whole electoral politics situation, we have what amounts to a kind of duopoly. We have this two-party system that crowds out any other ideological possibilities in the electoral politics. And this two-party system, both parties are very much invested in capitalism and racial capitalism. I think that we have to keep that always in mind. And the other thing, and this gets directly to your question, is that for me, this election was not about the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party. This was about white supremacy, white nationalism, settler colonialism, and Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Native people. Broadly in terms of racial and ethnic dimensions. And it was really, in my view, was about fascism versus the possibility of fending off fascism for, while albeit limited, more democratic possibilities. And I think that we have to make sure that we keep that in clear focus, because that's where we are. And I would also say that voting is just a strategy for a larger, more expanded notion of engagement and liberation, as my colleagues have talked about. And right now, where we are, we have a Democratic Party that is woefully inadequate and limited, but it's the better possibility than the what I call the Republican KKK party. Right? The Republican Party is the Klan. Let's be clear about their white nationalist party. This is all about white nationalism for them. The Democratic Party is led by neoliberals, but it has more ideological diversity than the Republican Party. So you have a coalition of progressive politicians in the House in particular, Latinx, Native and Indigenous, Black, LGBTQ plus. I mean, it's a whole array. And if you look at the two parties, you see a staunch difference between the Republican KKK party and the Democratic Party. So and the Democratic Party is in a struggle that is reflective of this election in the sense that that struggle is about the people who are now getting more involved in electoral politics, and we have the possibility of transforming the Democratic Party. We don't have a possibility of transforming the Republican Party. Might as well let them go and be white supremacists. That's what they are. But we have a possibility of transforming the Democratic Party. And I think that's what this election, among many, many other things, but that's what this election actually speaks to, is that more folks are involved because I think more folks understand that this is about white supremacy, white nationalism, settler colonialism, versus other possibilities that radically include and radically include liberation for self-determination for these other communities of color.
Thank you, Dr. Bailey. If anyone else wants to pick up on this question or add anything else, please feel free to jump in.
Sure, I'll jump in. I agree 100% with everything that Dr. Bailey just said. And I guess my 2 cents in sort of making sense out of the election was that we can't necessarily look at the Democratic Party as this. I mean, I think Dr. Bailey highlighted a lot of it in saying that, you know, the Democratic Party is not a monolithic party. Not everyone is the same. There are a lot of different factions working either together or antagonistically within this party. And I mean that in terms of like, and I'm just going to be very simplistic about it, but like the old guard Democrats in terms of like Joe Biden, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, versus what we're now calling like the squad, more of like the socialist Democrats, so like AOC and Ayanna Pressley and Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, like, and now Cori Bush, she's probably going to be joining into that group. So there are these factions that are working within the Democratic Party, but they're wrestling with one another in terms of more progressive policy. And I just want to say that historically, we can't overlook the fact that the Democratic Party has also enabled and facilitated lots of white supremacist type of policies in the past, you know, from the New Deal in terms of excluding predominantly African Americans and Mexican Americans from social welfare policies like Social Security, and sort of the exclusionary practices that were embedded into that legislation that has then had enormous effects going forward into the 20th century, to the initiation of the war on crime, which a lot of people associate as being something that was designed by the Nixon administration or even the Reagan administration, when actually it had its origins with President Johnson in 1965, who was a Democrat. So we need to not only just look at the Democratic Party as not just a monolith, but also recognize that it has a very long history, even if as it's changed over the 20th century, of upholding white supremacist policies. Joe Biden was a central figure in passing the 1994 crime bill, which accelerated policing and imprisonment into communities of color on an unprecedented level in 1994. So, and it's these types of policies that lead us into the present situation that we are in today. And so what it means for communities of color in particular is that, one, we need to continue to be active within the Democratic Party, because unfortunately that's, again, as Dr. Bailey pointed out, we are in a two-party system, both of which uphold racial capitalism. But it means that we need to continue to push these progressive policies and continue to hold these other old guard politicians accountable and try to get them to reform some of these other policies that they've held on so dear. Because as AOC pointed out, the Democrats who lost their seats in the House of Representatives in this last election were not losing their seats because they were talking about defunding the police. They were holding a more centrist position, and that's why they lost, because you don't win elections by taking the middle road. You win elections by inspiring people to go to the polls, and taking a middle of the road stance just doesn't inspire people to want to go and vote, especially if you're a person of color, especially in the middle of a pandemic, especially if your state has these repressive voter voter, what am I trying to say? Voter suppression tactics. There we go. Sorry, y'all, it's been a long week. But anyway, and so it's like there's just a lot that goes into it, and you're not going to hold on to power if you're just taking this kind of middle of the road stance. And so when people came out in unprecedented numbers in support of Joe Biden, I don't necessarily feel like they were doing it because of Joe Biden himself, because of the message that they were doing. It was in opposition to the other party necessarily. So
I'm snapping because right on, right. I'm so glad you said that, Dr. Bynum.
No, I agree. I mean, yes, brilliant comments from both of my colleagues. I would just, so for me, the test in thinking about, well, one thing I struggle about electoral politics in general is how to historically respect the struggles of communities of color that came before me, that in many ways, allows me, the sacrifice, the death, the violence that they suffered, allows me to be in a position where I can decide I'm going to vote or I'm not going to vote, right? So trying to maintain that type of historical respect for people who sacrifice their lives just for the right to vote, right? I think for me, so that's one thing. On the other hand, we're also not going to vote our way to liberation, right? So I think that where that for me emerges most clearly is when we look at the U.S. from the outside in, and that's the way I look at it, right? So from the perspective of empire, or another issue from the perspective of immigration, and there I think what if you look at it from the outside, and what emerges is what this really great quote that the Tanzanian revolutionary and president Julius Nyerere had when they asked him about what the U.S. political system looked like, and he responded that the U.S. is also a one-party state, but with typical American extravagance, they have two of them, right? So from looking at it from the external, through the perspective, through the lens of U.S. empire, it matters little to nothing whether it's a Democrat or Republican in power, right? And if we think about some of the major issues that we care about, that marginalized communities care about, whether it's police violence, whether it's migration, whether it's neoliberal capitalism that has ravaged communities of color and the working class in the United States, these processes all emerge in with this boomerang effect, right? With U.S. empire that begins right after independence in the Northwest War and taking land away from the Shawnee peoples in the Northwest Territories, to then extending that south into Mexico and then into the Caribbean and then throughout the world. And then that stuff comes back home, right? So the history of policing, right? It's linked with both slave patrols, but also counterinsurgency in the places like the Philippines in the late 19th, early 20th century. So I think we also have to keep that in mind. And I think there's a certain provincialism that guides particularly US media folks when they talk about these elections, and we miss out a big part of the picture. And we miss out that there is such a thing as a ruling class in this country. There is such a thing as a class hierarchy in this country. And you know what, I just saw earlier today, I saw this image of Kamala Harris, fist bumping Lindsey Graham on the floor of the Senate. Like, that's a ruling party, right? There's really very little struggle between the Democratic, especially the upper echelons of the Democratic Party and the upper echelons of the Republican Party, right? And this is how Dr. Bailey and Dr. Bynum described the generational guard, old guard versus new guard struggle. But even as I'm inspired by the squad, and I'm inspired by some of this younger, more radical generation of Democratic politicians, their limit always is U.S. empire. And this is where the limit of their radicalism. And I think we need to continue to push them to extend that limit and to lead to a serious critique of U.S. empire, just like the brilliant Ilhan Omar, when she questioned Elliot Abram for the first time in his career and put him on blast and basically said, like, you supported genocide in Central America. Like, why are you here, essentially? Why are you trying to do the same thing in Venezuela? And this, I think this analysis also extends into immigration. Like, there's a bipartisan consensus on immigration, despite the rhetoric. There's a reason why in our community, we refer to Obama as a deporter in chief, right? It's easy to demonize the bad orange man, but like the Obama administration handed him the machinery, and it's machinery that has history that goes all the way back to the Jimmy Carter administration, another Democrat, right? So, the difference should not have, for us, we have to push the radical limits of the debate beyond just smart walls versus an actual physical border wall at the border. Like, we have to be pushing them to say no border walls at all, because borders are violence. The last thing I'll say is there's a great meme that I saw a couple of weeks ago online where it showed like a B-52 bomber, and it's like Republicans, and it just shows the bomber like dropping bombs, and the Democrat version of the bomber was dropping bombs, but it had like a sticker for Black Lives Matter and like the gay liberation flag. Like, that's the type of bipartisan consensus that we have to push these more radical Democrats to like explode, essentially, and to accomplish serious change in this country.
I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Vivian. I just wanted to add one little point that that you brought up, is that we have to, and I think it's so important that you said that, we have to reframe, so the framing that the media, the mainstream and neoliberal, they create knowledge to justify racial capitalism. So, of course, as Dr. Bynum said, of course they're going to frame this whole debate between the Democrats, the neoliberals, the Nancy Pelosi's and the Bidens and even Clyburn, right? And them saying, oh, we lost the election because you all were chanting defund the police. And I had this argument with my mother, who's like, she's bought the Kool-Aid, she drank the Kool-Aid with the neoliberal media. And she said, well, Clyburn is right. These senators that are running in Georgia, they can't be saying defund the police because then they won't get elected. I said, Clyburn is wrong. He don't know what the hell he's talking about. It is the role of activists to constantly push our politicians and these Democrats to reframe the debate. Do not fall into that Republic KKK trap. That trap is, if we say, and first of all, I agree with Dr. Bynum, the reason why they lost is because they were middle of the road, and we are tired of that. We're tired of Black and brown people being murdered by the police. We're not going to do this reform foolishness anymore. No, absolutely not. And what I told my mother, I said, let me tell you this. If they do not know how to advocate for the will of the activists on the ground, the very people who will get them elected, they won't win the election. They won't, because Black and brown folks are no longer going to sit here and let politicians tell them that we need to reform the Klan. The police are the Klan. So we're not going to be running around here saying that we're going to reform and pick out the bad Klansmen and women in the police. No, the police are the Klan. And they better make sure that they articulate the will of the activists, or they will not be elected. They will not.
Thank you all. It's just, oh yeah, go ahead,
Can I
jump
just
in.
make one other point? I wanted, because Dr. Bailey reminded me when he was talking about the media being neoliberal. I don't remember exactly where I first saw it. I probably saw it on Twitter, but did anyone else see the cartoon that was drawn of John Lewis and John McCain like fist bumping each other in heaven? And I've been seeing a lot of people who are like, John McCain lives, he helped turn Arizona blue. Okay, first of all, John McCain voted alongside Trump 85% of the time when he was in office, 85% of the time. Okay, so sitting here and erasing the activism and the organizing of Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities in Arizona in favor of John McCain is offensive. And I took huge offense to it. And the fact that it was being shared over and over again by people that I respected, and putting him next to someone like John Lewis, I just say was even more offensive. So I just had to throw that out there and just say that this is the kind of narrative that is being pushed in our local media and in our national media. This is the type of narrative. You see people all the time who are just like, John McCain helped turn Arizona blue. No, he did not. That was not John McCain's work. John McCain has been dead now for more than a year. He's been dead for about 2 years now. And so we need to give credit where credit is due. And that is to the people who are organizing and engaging with communities here on the ground here, not people who are dead.
Right, and I think that's great. I mean, the McCain example is great. Like the lack of like historical memory, right? Like the guy who was like bombing civilian population centers in Vietnam, then gets like lionized as this politician who supported SB 1070, who supported the wall because it was convenient for him politically. I mean, it's ridiculous. Don't share that Avengers video, Diane. Don't you dare. That's the worst thing I've seen this year. I mean, I think with Clyburn, I also wanted to mention Clyburn's still fighting with Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture. Like he's still fighting that battle. And like I'm like, guy, just like give it up. And he got called out on one of his interviews because he had like a statue of like W.E.B. Du Bois as he's saying these things. Like, dude, like, do you not know who that man is that you have on your mantle? But I think what the reframing of the debate and these questions and issues that Dr. Bailey mentioned is so important. But the thing is that these Democrats fall into the trap every single time, and they're falling into it right now with Warnock and he having to apologize for having hosted his church having hosted Fidel Castro in 1995. And I want to be like, none of you have the moral authority to critique someone like Fidel Castro who actually helped liberate vast parts of Southern Africa from apartheid, while your country actually supported the apartheid regime. So it's like, but they fall into that red baiting every single time. And it doesn't matter whether there's specific instances like that, they're going to be called socialist regardless, right? So what happens if they just embrace it for once? Because it's gonna happen. That's like one of the only things that like Pete Buttigieg said that I've ever agreed with. He said it like a couple months ago or maybe it was one of the primary debates where he said that like, and don't tell anyone outside of this call that I agreed with Pete Buttigieg on something. So for those of my students that are on the call, but he basically said they're going to call us socialists regardless. Like, so why be afraid of it? And he was exactly right.
And they don't even know what socialism is. They don't even know what it is. That's the other thing. It's like, stop talking about something you don't have no idea what you're talking about.
Thank you all so much. I've really been learning a lot from these dialogues, and again, I'm so grateful for you all attending and participating in this panel. We're gonna go ahead and move on to the next question, if that's okay, unless anyone has anything else they'd like to add. Okay, but the next question is the Republican Party, specifically with the rise of Trump, has gained a higher number of votes, or gained a higher number of votes in 2020 from people within marginalized communities than in 2016. So I'm sure you all saw like Latinos for Trump or like all this rhetoric going around. And so our question is like, how can we engage these like right-leaning voters from marginalized communities, like with our like community struggles? Like, how do we kind of like, I don't know, like try to bring them in, or like try to like have like these dialogues with them? And yeah.
Don't play Despacito to try to, entice the Latino vote, because like, I'm just, I saw that and I was just like, that's just not going to work. No, I mean, I think, I mean, in all seriousness, like, I think the Democratic Party has like a serious issue with looking at different groups of people as monolithic groups, right? Like Latinos, they think are all Mexican or Mexican American, and you know, they don't necessarily appreciate the wide range of diversity within Latinos, and they don't look at different issues. I mean, racial identity is one part of our identity. They don't necessarily look at religious identity or occupational identity even. And I think I think the Republican Party has actually done a lot better of a job of connecting with people on other levels other than just race. And so I think that helps explain like why so many more people of color ended up voting for Trump in 2020 than in 2016, because the Democratic Party just didn't engage with people. They saw African Americans all on this like one kind of voter, and they just thought, well, we have that in the bag, so we're not going to even try. And it's the same with Latinos. And there were widespread campaigns within the Republican Party to try to recruit Latinos and using certain types of issues to gain those types of voters. So using things like taxes, using things like abortion, gay marriage, things that are traditionally wedge issues, but we're able to, you know, get a wider variety of people from these different marginalized communities. So in a sense, I think that Republicans in many ways are better at recognizing that we as people have different identities that aren't necessarily just wrapped up in race.
You know, I think this is a difficult question. I like Dr. Bynum's answer because it helped me think about this differently and get beyond my fury at the way that white supremacy the way that racism and white supremacy and heteropatriarchy is structuring this whole electorate, and how Black people, for example, end up, supporting issues or supporting candidates that are not in their interest. Right? So, I mean, this is like quintessential Gramscian hegemony, right? But I think part of the problem for me is that, again, it is the manufacturing of consent by the mainstream media, because the mainstream media focuses on the 18% of Black men that supposedly voted for the barbarian in chief, and the 8% of Black women who voted for the barbarian in chief. And, it's like the vast majority of Black people voted for Biden and Harris. For whatever reason, the vast majority voted against the barbarian, right? That's what we need to focus on. What happens is, so it's interesting because while Dr. Bynum is right that there is this way in which the Democratic Party kind of, and even the mainstream media kind of take these racial groups and amalgamate them and make them sort of this monolith. There's also a way in which the media likes to overemphasize a minority within a minority position to say, see, what's happening here. And the other thing that bothers me is that this is about white supremacy. And there are Black people who are anti-Black. There are Latinx people who are anti-Latinx. That exists. And this is ultimately about white supremacy and the different strategies that the Republican KKK party uses, and that the Democrats also are engaged in and participate in and use certain dimensions of the Democratic Party to maintain the racial capitalism, in my view, that this society is based on. And the last thing I'll say about this too, that I should have mentioned earlier, is that we, also they said 55% of white women voted for the Barbarian. And so the analysis that needs to happen more broadly is, how is heteropatriarchy co-constitutive with white supremacy? This is ultimately not just about white supremacy and white nationalism, it's about white male rule. Because the white men will never, ever allow for white women to have equal power. We live in a heteropatriarchal society. That means it's male rule. They may have they might be, closer proximity to power. But this is ultimately about white male rule. They use white women to consolidate white male rule. So we also have to kind of think about the way this sort of cultural politics function within this electorate. I have to say that, I'm just not ready to try to engage the Klan. I don't know. I don't know what to do. I'm not ready to I don't want to try to win them over. I don't have a strategy for engaging the Klan and people who support the Klan. I'm at a loss, but I think that it's important that the way we frame it, and the way we have to create the counter narrative to the dominant narrative that likes to frame it in ways that hides the white supremacy and the heteropatriarchy, hide the racial capitalism, and pretend that it's something else when it's not.
Yeah, no, I'll just add that I think this is to Dr. Bailey's comment about the way mainstream media framed this issue. I actually feel like this is like overblown in terms of statistically. Like, I think the sensationalist treatment of like why Latinx voters voted for Trump in such big numbers, and like it's like people in the mainstream media need like some like really serious like educational historical training on like, one, that Latinx, Latino, Hispanic, whatever, it doesn't exist, right? And it's actually, in terms of trying to like differentiate voting patterns, like it's useless as a term. It is completely useless. So this whole media framing of, oh my goodness, Trump got like a huge percentage of Latinx voters, how could he? I mean, it's like they're talking about like a couple of border counties in Texas, and they're talking about South Florida. And honestly, I don't think we're gonna like, there's one way they can try to win South Florida, right? And it's not gonna be running away from any mention of Fidel Castro or Hugo Chavez or whatever, right? That's not gonna be. I think Bernie Sanders, and one of the guys that I like listening to that I think is right on this issue is Chuck Rocha, who he's a voting consultant, and he worked on the Bernie Sanders campaign. And the reason that he identifies as Bernie Sanders being so successful in courting Latinx support, because they had people on the ground, like knocking on doors, talking to people. And that's the number one way to reach Latinx voters. And I think that's the way to counterbalance certain communities in Miami that tend to suck up all the air in the room when it comes to discussing broader Latinx political habits and voting habits, right? Like, honestly, if I told you that the third biggest Latinx population in Florida after the Cubans and the Puerto Ricans were Mexicans, most people would be amazed. But there's like 300,000 to 400,000 of them. But who gets the attention? It's Cuban American voters that are also themselves divided along generational lines and along racial lines. Like, my first job in academia was at Florida State, and I'm so grateful that I was there because it broke down so many stereotypes that I had of Cuban Americans, because they were like most of my students. But there's severe, like, defund the police and BLM, that was a way for like elite, older, white Cubans to essentially express their racism without having to be racist, right? They just use coded language, and that's pretty apparent. But it's the Venezuelans who are less than 100,000 who get all the attention. It's essentially, you know, Miami's like the right-wing Latin American rich exile capital of Latin America. So it's anytime there's a revolution or popular movement in Latin America, their elites leave, and where do? They go to Miami. So of course they have capital, they have all sorts of influence, right? So stepping back, then I think this is actually like an overblown issue. I think, like Dr. Bailey mentioned and Dr. Bynum, like the issue should be on those 55% of white women that voted for Trump, or the college educate, right? We go to college to reach a higher level of enlightenment, right? And yet Trump is still winning a majority of college educated whites. Why is that? Right. So I think this issue can be deployed and used by the Democrats as cover for their own failings as a political party in being able to recruit support. And the issue with Black men, I feel like it's the respectability politics that's being used to describe this I think statistically minor issue, right? The idea that like we're gonna look at the voting habits of a very small percentage of Black men through the lens of Lil Wayne and Kanye West and Ice Cube is ridiculous, right? But that's the attention, and that's just cover. Right. But here comes the respectability police. Here comes Clyburn. Here comes Obama in his memoir. Obama the other day was talking about, you know, because there's the Black men voted for Trump, voted for him because they're into rap that's all about bling bling and materialism. It's like, dude, that was hip hop like 20 years ago. You obviously haven't kept up. Now it's like radically different. So I think the issue that's really pertinent is knocking on people's doors and thinking about the heterogeneity of Latinx populations, and also not assuming that all Latinx peoples have immigration as their number one concern. And that's what happened in South Texas, right? A lot of these people voted for Trump because they work in the oil industry, and they heard all this propaganda that you know, Biden was going full new green deal, and he was going to get rid of oil production, right? So I think anyway. That's I'll stop at that.
No, and if I can add on to that, Dr. Vina, I think you make an excellent point. I'm from Texas, and I'm used to no one ever politically paying attention to Texas because of this assumption that it's always going to be red, right? It's always going to be a red state. And within the last 4 years or so, we've had a lot of enthusiasm over Democratic candidates. And I'm talking specifically about Beto O'Rourke, right? Like Beto O'Rourke was a candidate who had a lot of problems, but he was going up against one of the most like vile senators in our history, like Ted Cruz, right? And he had a really strong campaign. He went to every single one of however many counties Texas has. I know it's like the biggest state ever, and like went out and talked to people. And I think the Democratic Party really relied a lot, maybe too much, on that momentum from 4 years ago or from 2 years ago. Whenever, I feel like this has like been the longest 4 years of my life. I can't even remember when that election actually happened, but like it was, they relied so much on that momentum. And Dr. Urbina makes a really great point, which is that they just let it sit that way instead of continually going out and engaging with people. That was the problem. They just said, well, Beto O'Rourke was almost like about to get elected, and I bet a lot of more people are going to get enthusiastic about this election. And there was talk about Texas maybe even turning blue. And I, didn't believe it because I just didn't see the same type of engagement, particularly in like the senatorial races with MJ Hager battling John Cornyn. It was like, it was the most vanilla candidate you could have put up against John Cornyn. And it was just like that momentum was not there in this election either. And so it was no surprise to me that Texas once again turned red and that these border communities also went red. Texas is not necessarily a red state. It's really a non-voting state. A lot of people don't vote because they don't feel like their voices are going to be heard. And that goes back to a lot of the problems with the Electoral College. Texas is a winner-take-all type of state. And so if you have all of these counties that are predominantly red and you're voting blue, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. So yeah, they were just not necessarily engaging with these communities on the ground. And that's why Texas continued to go red, even when there was like talk about it turning purple or maybe even turning blue. Just didn't happen.
Can I just say something real quick? Because I got another example that Dr. Bynum brought up, and Dr. King, Kentucky. Why the hell the Democrats gonna run that? Who was her name? They had an opportunity to run the brother against Turkey Neck McConnell, and they ran this white woman, middle of the road. She didn't even McGrath didn't even thank you. Didn't engage the black community, nothing. And then they wonder why. That I mean, like Turkey Neck McConnell Crook is hated in Kentucky. If you had to run this black candidate, the guy from the state legislature in Kentucky, uh, he would have had a better chance of beating because he would have energized the communities in Kentucky, the communities of color in Kentucky. But this gets to the other point that I think is really important that I forgot to include in my comment, and where both the Republican KKK have no interest, the Democrats, the neoliberals don't either, is that, and Obama was a main person that, one of the folks that did this, no one ever talks about poverty. Poverty. We have about 140 million people living in poverty or low income. When is the last time you heard the Democrat presidential candidates say poverty or the impoverished? They always say middle class. They never talk about poverty. Obama never talked about poverty. I don't even remember when Obama let the word of poverty come out of his mouth. And so meanwhile, you have a party, both parties are so deeply invested in racial capitalism that the majority of the folk who can actually transform the politics and the party and be more engaged are all folks who are socioeconomically dispossessed, disenfranchised, living in abject poverty. I mean, our poverty situation in this country is through the roof before the pandemic. Before the pandemic. And both parties pretend as it doesn't exist, as that there's no poverty problem. And that the poverty problem is not so disastrous, it's so significant that we actually should change the way we legislate. We actually should change the way we govern. But both parties are not really, and the squad is, and the progressive and the Democratic Socialists and the Democratic Party are. But as Dr. Bynum said, they're being crowded out. They're being crowded out, and they get framed, and they get people like Clyburn saying that they stop saying socialists and all of this foolishness, and then we get distracted, and then we end up not talking about what one of the central problems, the intersections of race and poverty in this country. That's one of the central problems, and heteropatriarchy, central problems that we face in this country.
Thank you all so much. Unless anyone has anything else to add, we're gonna go ahead and move on to the next question. And then the next question is that this election has been characterized as a historic first. Kamala Harris will be the first Black South Asian woman serving as U.S. Vice President. What gains can we expect from representational politics in the context of broader liberation? What does it mean that we have our first woman vice president of color? What can we expect to gain from that? Thank you.
I mean, yeah, this is an amazing question. As somebody who is mixed, I can't emphasize enough how monumental this moment really is. And it's unfortunate that so much of the media coverage, especially in the days during the election and immediately after, overshadowed this point, right? That Kamala Harris was going to be the first, not only first woman, but a person who is African American and South Asian woman as vice president. As somebody who is mixed, again, like I'm just not used to seeing people who who are in my position. Like when I was growing up, I was like a unicorn. Like there were not mixed race people where I was. Like people just didn't know. And I think that I get really emotional thinking about this, right? Because even though I don't agree with a lot of what Harris stands for, and on a more personal level and political level, even I can appreciate that she is in a position of power now that it hasn't been recognized before, and it's one that is extraordinarily important for women, and particularly women of color who now can see themselves, rising to these types of positions. And I'll stop there because there's so much more that can be said, and I still haven't yet been able to really wrap my head around the gravity of it, just because it's one of those issues that it's like it still like confounds me to this very day. And I just, like, because of everything else that's been going on, I haven't really been able to like wrap my head around like exactly what it means, because again, it's such a personal thing for me. It's like, again, as somebody who is mixed and is just not used to seeing other mixed people in these types of positions, it's like it's crazy. It's still crazy to me. So I'll stop there and let my other panelists speak.
Thank you, Dr. Bynum. Oh, Dr. Bailey, if you'd like to go ahead.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with Dr. Bynum, and there's a side of me that, just like, similar to Obama, when Obama became president, there's a side of me that I get caught up in the rapture and the symbolism and the access to this position and the historical significance. But I also have to say to myself and to my community that sometimes this country, the way this society maintains its racial capitalist interests, maintain its white supremacist interests and white heteropatriarchal interests, is to use those who are from those very marginalized communities and put them in the seat of empire. And similar to what Dr. Avina said, is that what happens is that they confront empire, even as they are trying to actually create policy or implement policy that would transform the social relations and social hierarchies that actually are the foundation of this society. And I would offer that how we deal with that is that as communities, we have to push them. We cannot make the mistake that we made with Obama, where I don't think communities that voted for him pushed him to do better. And he ended up doing very little. That's not to say that I'm not trying to draw false equivalency between him and the current mess that we have in the power. But he did far less than he should have, and we, I think many of us got caught up in the symbolism and him being in the seat of power, the first Black person, African American in history. And so there's even more symbolism. There's even more weight and weight and history and accomplishment that is situated within Kamala Harris's vice presidency, being the first woman, being the first mixed woman, Black and South Asian. And also, being the first person who does not come from, in terms of her education, she doesn't come from these institutions. Her undergrad is a historically Black institution. She got a law degree from Hastings, University of California, Hastings. So she's not the Harvard and Yale and all of that stuff that we are been used to by neither. He got his law degree from Syracuse University. So while they are in some ways closer to, particularly Vice President-elect Harris, closer to our communities, we have to push them to do our will. We have to push them to do our will, and we cannot give up. And this gets to, I think that the other subsequent question about what do we do post-election. Elections are one strategy for a much longer, larger goal, and that is liberation. And like both of my colleagues said, we will not vote our way into liberation. We will not vote our way out of oppression. We will only get out of oppression by being engaged and pushing our politicians and not getting too caught up in the accomplishment of having the first. That first has to be held accountable to make change on our behalf.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bailey. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Viña.
I think the only thing I have to add is that, the cynical me would say this doesn't matter, right? As Dr. Bailey said, we just have a person of color at the engine of empire, right? But I think symbolically it matters a huge deal. I think in terms of representation, it matters a huge deal in terms of, my kids seeing someone like Harris on the TV, right? And my kids are mixed. They get to see a mixed person on TV that's in a position of power. I mean, that there is a certain power in that, right? That we cannot negate, right? There is at the personal level, at the symbolic level, at the representational level. It matters. It matters a lot. It also matters internationally. I remember when Obama was elected in Latin America, there was great hope because of who he was, that somehow that was going to change U.S. empire in Latin America. And there's a very famous moment in which Obama's first trip to a Latin American summit, Hugo Chavez stood up, shook his hand, and then gave him a copy of Eduardo Galeano's The Open Veins of Latin America. And it was just like, for me, I was watching this, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And then, nothing happened. But it's still like, it matters, right? So I think part of this is, as Dr. Bailey said, we have to push, right? We have to push. Power concedes nothing without demand, as Frederick Douglass famously wrote, right? So it also, I think, encourages us to be like radically intersectional in our analysis. Like this has to force us to be able to think about class, race, and gender all at the same time. And she will allow us, in her position of power, will allow us to, I think, hopefully critically and radically analyze that.
Thank you. It definitely helps, process what just happened, because I know a lot of people like myself are in just kind of like very weird situation, weird positions in which you're like, oh, what does this even mean, And so I've been learning a lot throughout this whole panel. But thank you for answering that question.
Can I say one thing that I forgot that I think is also important? It is also important that both of my colleagues just pointed out too, representation, but what this administration will look like. That's really important. Now, to be sure, that's one thing that we can say about the Democratic Party, right? The administration is going to look very different than this current white nationalist administration that we have right now. So you're going to have Black women, you're going to have women of color, you're going to have LGBTQ plus people all up in there. And, if hopefully we get the Senate, because Turkey Neck McConnell Crook is not going to have anybody progressive advance as a cabinet person. So he's going to block all of that. But you're going to have secretaries that will look more race, ethnic, gender, sexuality, class diverse, way more than what the other party would like. So that, I mean, that is important. That is important. What is also going to be important is we have to push the Biden administration to make sure that this is not just about representation, right? So we need to have people who not just represent representation, but actually do some shit, right? Do some stuff and have them in their respective position that they're going to transform policy and transform the way this country, this government governs, and transform the conditions that we're living in, because this whole poverty thing is serious. This is some serious stuff, and we need people to start saying the word poverty in this administration. Sorry about interrupting.
No, you're absolutely fine. Um, I don't know if anyone else has anything else they'd like to add. Um, if not, we will continue to our fifth and final question for the panel tonight. And it's, what are some forms of action that we can take outside of electoral institutions to support our communities? I know we've talked about this already, like it's been brought up like here and there, but like, I guess just like a more in-depth conversation would help.
As someone who really studies and researches community activists and community organizers in local communities, right? Like, I think the biggest thing that you can do outside of voting, right, is making sure that you are invested in your community. And I don't mean necessarily like monetarily, but you know, we have other types of electoral positions, right? Like we have city council members, we have state representatives, we have county officials, we have, you know, whatever. We have lots of different mechanisms that affect us probably more on a day-to-day basis than national electoral politics. And making sure that if the city council is like passing some oppressive city ordinances in terms of policing or you know, lacking education, or you know, whatever it is, making sure that you are going down to city hall and like raising hell about those issues, and like going up and speaking and constantly meeting with your elected officials and making sure that you are invested in your community and are speaking out against whatever the issue is. So you can't necessarily just go to the polls every 4 years and just hope that change is going to come your way. You actually have to go out and make it happen. And that means not only talking with your politicians, but also talking with other people in your community. Some of the most interesting stories that I've heard, because I'm an oral historian, so I've interviewed lots of community organizers, are not necessarily the people that are marching in the streets and protesting. They're the ones who are going and knocking door to door and talking with their neighbors and asking for donations for bail money, you know, for people who have gotten arrested, or who are trying to get people registered to vote, or who are, you know, forming civic types of organizations to make sure that their neighborhoods have sidewalks or street lights, or you know, whatever it is. It's becoming more involved and acting more as a community. I feel like that is a really prime example of how we can try to make our lives the way that we hope to make them, is just being more actively involved on the local level. Because if the only thing that you're doing is going and voting in the gubernatorial election or the presidential election, like it's not going to happen. It's just not. Like you have to get more engaged with what's going on the local level.
I totally agree. I would only add to that, Diane and your colleagues, this is also very important form of engagement outside of electoral politics. You organizing, you and your colleagues organizing this is really important, and you should, as much as you can, continue to organize these kinds of events, because it's about knowledge. People, we have to, this all, like the discussions that we just had, we studied this, and sometimes, folks don't, they don't have the kind of opportunity to be in spaces where you can actually have these kinds of discussions. Take advantage of that, because how we frame these debates and how we frame these politics and how we create counter narratives to the dominant narrative, which is invested in racial capitalism, maintaining the status quo, basically, just, putting flowers around it and making it smell better, is important for informing how you both engage in electoral politics, but also how you engage in social and cultural politics and engage in the things that Dr. Bynum is talking about. So I think that is really, really important. And not just happening within the academy, but also outside of it in communities.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think if anything, we should be working to disrupt any sort of artificial boundary between the academy or in our place in the university and like our broader communities here and in the valley in Phoenix. I mean, I think another way to think about this question is, instead of presupposing action, I mean, I think we can think about what are some forms of organizing that we can take, right? I mean, I think back to how we started, how Dr. Bynum started this conversation on this question, right? I think if you talk to organizers, if you talk to people who have been in social movements, the first thing they do when they think about it is how to organize. And I think that's really important in our current moment, because we live in a social system that finds a variety of different ways to encourage us not to create community, not to create organization. It encourages us to be solitary. It doesn't help that we're in a pandemic, but like that's only intensifying what neoliberal capitalism is telling us to do. It's telling us to be isolated. It's telling us to be individualistic. It's telling us to consume. So I think at a initial level, we have to work against that, right? So we think about, how do we create community? How do we create organization? And in that type of conversation, interaction with people, then you figure out the type of action that will move you forward, right? But I think the initial moment is that organizing, community building aspect that then you can create, around consensus, around decision. Then you decide on what type of action your particular community needs, right? So at ASU, right, since the summer, like one of the exciting things for me to see is to see students like organize around, defunding ASU police, right? And it's been great to see, and it's been great to be pushing that demand at another level and seeing how uncomfortable ASU administrators get. But that's, you're starting from you're starting from your position as a student within the university and working out from there. And also, like, I think you have also a responsibility, right? Particularly if you're a student, a working class student of color, who you may be the first person in your family, broader extended family, to actually go to college. Like, that adds another layer of responsibility, an urgency that you have, or that you may feel, that many of your classmates at ASU or other universities may not feel. But that also gives you a link into these communities. Like, you're already plugged into certain communities that can play a really important role politically and socially here in Arizona. But I think starting with how to think about who to organize with, what to organize, how to build community, how to create consciousness raising events, as Dr. Bailey mentioned, like, this is really important. And then really working to democratize access to knowledge and disrupting the boundary that exists between the university and the outside community. It shouldn't be an outside community, particularly at a place at ASU where social embeddedness is like a core principle of the charter, right? So that gives us all sorts of encouragement and leeway to remove those barriers, right? What can we do then within our positions in the university? What can we do outwards?
Oh, thank you all. Again, wonderful responses. I've been learning a lot, and I don't know if anyone else has any of the panelists have anything else to add. to this question in particular. But we have about, if not, or if not, we have about like 10 minutes for like a short Q&A session. I don't know if any of the attendees have any questions. Feel free to drop them in the chat or just unmute yourself. Thank you again, everyone, for being so respectful during the panel. We had like no disruption, so that's great. And I appreciate that. So if anyone wants to like unmute their microphones now, feel free to do so. Feel free to ask questions and engage with these wonderful panelists who have dedicated this time to us. So yeah, anyone have any questions?
I have a comment more than a question. I just want to say thank you for, teaching me a lot about these current issues, and I really enjoyed this discussion that you guys put on. So I want to thank El Concilio for even considering doing something as important as this, because it's really necessary. That it's it has a lot to do with beyond voting too. Voting isn't really gonna get a lot of things. So it's kind of really important to acknowledge that, and types of discussions like these, educate people. And so I just want to say that.
I think Leah raised her hand.
This is just a spitballing a question. So it kind of connected with marginalized communities, or just anyone who's leaning more towards, right-wing politics, is, do you believe that fake news and so many people that get their news sites from just algorithms that are taught to just keep their attention, do you think that that's a threat to, spreading racism across our country and into politics? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we're in a situation where this is not only a coronavirus pandemic. It's an anti-intellectual pandemic. So yeah, there's a lot of news. A lot of it is crap. A lot of it is, even the more reliable, frames things in a way that supports the status quo. It's really important that we try to expand and diversify our knowledge sources. And it's really important. And this is the academy, but also outside of the academy, community forums, discussions like this really help us to develop the critical thinking skills, so that we don't accept face value neither the dominant representational framing of the debate or the fake BS framing of the debate. And I think that that's where we are, that we have to really deploy, we have to develop, help each other develop, and to deploy critical thinking tools, so that we have a kind of larger analysis. Similar to what Dr. Avino said, we have to have an analysis that is intersectional, right? So that is something that kind of analytic tool is something that you just don't, read an article and learn it. It's something that has to be engaged and constantly thought through and discussed on an ongoing basis, so that tool begins to help you understand these kind of larger socio-political aspects of our society, that then that fake news and the BS that we're constantly bombarded with, you'd be like, no, child, that's not the tea. That's not the tea. We're not going to go that route. So I think that's where we're going to, that's where we need to go, because the society maintains itself by, this kind of current social strata that we live in, it maintains itself by misinformation and the lack of information and the lack of intellectual critical tools to understand what's actually happening.
I think we also have to be careful that to not get carried away with thinking about fake news and the media as something new, right? So, I mean, I think to a certain extent, the very idea of the US and American exceptionalism has been fake news from the beginning, right? So I think what we see now is an intensification of it because of new technological innovations. But honestly, I'm more interested in the conditions that allow for the dissemination of this fake news rather than the fake news itself, right? So why does, I mean, politicians and the American state has the power to dismantle Facebook, Twitter, whatever. Like there's been but they don't, right? So there's been a decision made at some level that says it's okay for these social media companies to determine, to monetize every aspect of our life, and then also to feed us fake news, right? And then that places an additional burden on us to develop and to think about, as Dr. Bailey was saying, tools of critical analysis and thinking that allows us to like distinguish the fake news with the real news, right? But this has been going on at least since the 80s with like the postmodern turn and these crazy ideas on hyper reality and what is real and what isn't real, and like Matrix stuff, like old movie, like Matrix stuff, type stuff. But like I'm actually way more interested in the power that we've given to 2 or 3 companies to determine our access to information and the dissemination of that information, and the way that they did it, right? Like they colonized our memories and our family lives and our internal home lives to the point where we like depend on these social media things. It becomes very hard for us to break away. So I think that's a bigger issue than this issue of fake news that has been around since the foundation of this country.
Thank you again so much for just helping us just process everything. And we've all learned, I mean, I think I can speak for everyone when I say we've all learned a lot tonight. It's just been really helpful. So yeah, I appreciate you all for participating in this panel. I know right now, like there's a lot going on, so please understand how grateful we are to have you here. If there's not any more questions, I'm not sure. I don't see anyone else with their hand raised, but I do want to be respectful of your time. So please, yeah, just thank you. I don't know if anyone has any like last comments or anything like that. If not, then
This was great, and I learned a lot from Dr. Bynum and Dr. O'Brien. So, this was wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. This was great. Thank you.
It was so much fun. I'm so glad that you all invited us to be a part of this panel. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Great questions.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you. And also thank you, Hasiel. Shout out to Hasiel because he really helped me plan out this event and like helped me come up with the questions. So thank you. I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. Thank you.